One easy way to remember how Hitler came to power is to learn a new acronym, LIMP paper. So we are familiar with these ideas, but just as a little bit of a recap, realize that one of the major reasons why Hitler, or any fascist for that matter, Hitler was just at the right place in the right time, was because of this long-term bitterness that had lasted ever since the Treaty of Versailles. The stabbed in the back theorists are all trying to look for someone to blame. Ultimately, Hitler sort of satisfies a lot of these people's scapegoating nature by continuing to blame the Jews and the Slavs for the problems that Germany has suffered and the weakness of the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Constitution was not particularly effective either, so that's another major reason why Hitler was able to rise to power. So, despite the fact that Germany attempted to establish a democratic government, it was not working very well. Money realized that after or during the Great Depression, the financial chaos that started around 1929 and persisted into 1932, 1933 was one of the major reasons why the Nazis were able to gain so many seats in the Reichstag. Hitler also had effective use of propaganda, which we will elaborate on a little bit later. Hitler also had an idea for a program, right? He gave promises to his people about how he would improve their economic, political, and social status. So actually trying to articulate a plan was another reason why Hitler was able to come to power. Trying to attack all opposition, particularly the communists, who again he saw as one of the reasons why Germany was stabbed in the back. Personal qualities. Hitler was seen in his time as a very charismatic, enthusiastic speaker. He was able to generate quite a crowd. One of the reasons why, of course, the Nazi Party goes from just 7 people to 100,000 people in a very short period of time was because of Hitler's ability to generate a powerful speech. Economic depression goes along with the idea of money, but just again to reiterate the idea that the devastating 43% unemployment rate in Germany in the early 1930s was a major reason why Hitler was able to rise to power. And lastly, the president actually was responsible for recruiting Hitler into power. So because the president himself supported Hitler becoming chancellor, it's another reason why he was able to quickly rise to power. So once Hitler actually is chancellor, it's important to realize that he very quickly moves to consolidate power. One of the things that he wants to do, even though Hindenburg appointed him chancellor, he wants to sort of legitimize his power and also try to gain a Nazi majority in the Reichstag. So he calls for a new election in March of 1933. Again, he wants Nazis to win more seats, and then he wants, basically, if there are more Nazis in the Reichstag, he'll feel like he has a mandate to institute whatever sort of policies he wants. As a Nazi with a majority of Nazis in the Reichstag, he could basically have free reign in terms of shaping policy. While the campaigns were going on in 1933, the Reichstag building actually caught on fire, which you can see here. And when the Reichstag building caught on fire, Hitler actually uses the incident to blame the communists. He argued that the communists actually started the fire, which contributes to more opposition to the communists, right? Hitler also convinces President Hindenburg to give him emergency powers. And so after the Reichstag fire, Hitler actually abolishes freedom of speech and other personal liberties. Again, the Reichstag fire is a way that Hitler can effectively scapegoat in order to try to attack opposing political parties that might challenge the Nazis. Some historians actually argue that the Nazis themselves started the Reichstag fire, but it's difficult to actually tell. But nonetheless, Hitler sort of took advantage of this situation by blaming an opposing party. After the 1933 elections, interestingly, the Nazis do not gain the majority of the Reichstag, despite Hitler's use of the Reichstag fire and Hitler's attempt to abolish freedom of speech. The Nazis gain 44% of the vote in 1933. Another thing that's surprising is that Hitler actually uses the brown shirts pretty fiercely during the campaigns in 1933 to try to suppress opposition. But nonetheless, the Nazis do not get the majority in the Reichstag in 1933. And so what Hitler actually does instead is, again, use his lawmaking powers to figure out a way to bypass the fact that the Nazis do not have the majority. So the Reichstag passes the Enabling Act in March of 1933. And what the Enabling Act does is it gives Hitler absolute dictatorial power for 4 years. And it also makes it so that only the Nazi Party is the legal party in the Reichstag. So effectively, since Hitler could not actually get what he wanted through the elections themselves, he gets it through the Enabling Act, right? The Communist Party no longer is a threat because it's outlawed. The Enabling Act makes it so that the Nazi Party is the only party. And it's also important to realize that the Enabling Act was a legal measure, right? Because the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act into law, Hitler basically didn't really receive that much opposition because these measures to give him much more power were all achieved legally. So important to realize that not only does Hitler kind of rise to power through legitimate means, but he also consolidates his power through legitimate means through measures like the Enabling Act. Hitler also is going to quickly abolish strikes and outlaw independent labor unions. All right, this is another way to prevent any type of uprising from a communist opposition. Even if the Communist Party was outlawed, the actions of the working class were still a threat. So by getting rid of strikes and labor unions, it was another way that he tried to control the working class. These labor unions were replaced by an organization called the Nazi Labor Front. And basically this made it so that any independent worker organization now was effectively brought under Nazi control. Okay, so now, there was no ability for people to unionize outside of the single-party government. You also saw serious censorship of the press, of any form of literature. Even universities did not have the ability to publish whatever information they wanted. So you saw that democratic, socialist, and Jewish literature was blacklisted. Students and professors actually took forbidden books and they would burn them in public places. So this is an image of a public book burning here. You also saw a severe censorship of art. Modern art and architecture, which was dubbed degenerate art by the Nazis, was prohibited. Here's an example of degenerate art. Some of the things we talked about in chapter 28 we could see as degenerate art, like Dadaism, for example. Basically, the idea was that it was going against some of the glorification of Nazi Germany, and so you found that much more classical art was what was promoted by the Nazis instead of these new, I guess you could say, sort of experimental forms of art that also sort of critiqued notions of progress. You wanted to glorify the German state, so you didn't want to have anything that could be construed as negative. Propaganda. Hitler is a very, very good example of sort of championing propaganda in order to glorify his rule, in order to glorify Germany and the Nazi state. We talked about this a little bit in a previous chapter, but just as a reminder, an important name to know here would be Joseph Goebbels. He was Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, and so basically it was his job to figure out every way possible to glorify Hitler and the Nazi state. A very good example of a filmmaker who did this was Leni Riefenstahl, a woman who filmed The Triumph of the Will, which was a documentary about the Nuremberg rallies of 1934, and it basically tried to portray Hitler as larger than life, godlike, just again sort of demonstrating the sheer power of the Nazi regime. Also, the propaganda tried to demonize the Jewish population. You see here, this is a film called Der ewige Jude, which means the eternal Jew. And again, it was sort of playing upon sort of the inferior, so to speak, racial characteristics of the Jewish population. This is very much a caricature of a Jewish visage, right? And it's really meant to kind of demonize the Jewish population and promote that sense of racism that we know sort of characterizes the Nazi Party. This is a really brief clip demonstrating a use of propaganda through film, so I'll just take a second to show this. Well, it looks like it's not actually playing here, so what I'll do is include a link so that you can see it on your own time. But again, definitely be sure you are familiar with Joseph Goebbels and his use of propaganda. Another thing that Hitler is going to do in order to consolidate power is gain control of the army. All right, because the army actually remained independent of the Nazi Party as late as 1934, and so Hitler was really nervous that actually even the brown shirts themselves, the stormtroopers, the SA, as we know, was potentially going to revolt against Hitler's capitalist economy and Hitler's government, right? Hitler was very afraid that the SA was actually going to absorb the army and work against Hitler. And so when he was warned that the SA actually might stage what they called a second revolution, a communist revolution, he needed to do something pretty extreme to purge the SA from power. Now, one of the reasons why the SA was interested in kind of revolting against Hitler's reign was because the SA was responsible for Hitler's rise to power, and a lot of them felt mandated, felt like they deserved higher positions of power after Hitler rose to become chancellor. And so this sort of sense that they deserved powerful positions was something that made Hitler nervous. And so what Hitler did was he actually took his personal guard, they were called the SS, and they ended up arresting and shooting without trial about 1,000 SA leaders and other political enemies. So again, this was called the Night of the Long Knives. It was in June of 1934, and what we see is this is an effective purging of this paramilitary group that at least was threatening to take over the army. And now what you're going to see is when the SA declines in influence, the SS, Hitler's personal guard, is actually going to emerge and become very powerful and influential as Hitler's private army and secret police. What you're going to find is that the SS is eventually going to turn into, they're going to join forces with the Gestapo, a very powerful political police force, which we know is responsible for rounding up the Jewish population during the final solution Nazi Holocaust. This event, the Night of the Long Knives, was very pleasing to conservatives because, again, it prevented any sort of backlash against Hitler's legitimacy of power. Again, you can see, sort of like Stalin's Great Purge, this is a good example of Hitler actually going against a group that had originally supported him. So very, very significant showing of how Hitler was able to maintain power after he already gained control. Another way that Hitler can continue to have so much influence over his population, similar to Mussolini, but he does it to an even larger extent, is he influences people from a very young age. And this is no better demonstrated than the Hitler Youth, which was an organization actually for young boys and girls to basically explain to them at a very young age how glorious the Nazi state was. It was meant to train young boys to join the military and meant to train young girls to become effective mothers of the Reich, have Nazi babies, essentially. Pretty shortly into the establishment of the Hitler Youth, membership of the Hitler Youth actually became mandatory. So it's important to realize that, you know, people would join Nazi organizations because they had absolutely no choice otherwise. This also shows us what a true totalitarian regime is, right? The idea was that everyone had to participate. If this was a conservative authoritarian regime that we saw back in the days of absolutism, people wouldn't have to participate, right? But the Hitler Youth, you see that every single person in society plays a role, right, with mandatory participation. You actually had Hitler Youth members. They were obligated to turn in their teachers if their teachers said anything that made them seem disloyal to the Reich, which is actually sort of frightening to think that even children themselves had a lot of power to basically purge any sort of dissent or opposition. And again, it shows you how you know, effective Nazis were trained at a very young age. We'll move on to talk about the persecution of the Jews and the development of the Holocaust. And then after that, we will talk about World War II.